Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome back to our third unit in the Humanities class. When we're here, we're going to be continuing our discussion and study of the world religions, but we're going to be taking a distinctly closer look at our first Abrahamic religion, which is Judaism. Now, Judaism is a very interesting religion for a number of different reasons. And so, because of that, we need to approach it in some sense with a sense of openness, because we very frequently what I encounter in my classes, depending on where I'm teaching, especially, but overall it's the same thing that I notice quite a bit, is this pattern of over familiarity. We have a distinctly over familiar sort of sensation when we approach Judaism, and then even more so Christianity. And what I try to demonstrate to my students is that there are some elements that we overlook, there are some little details that we overlook, and therefore there's a lot of meaning that we overlook in these faiths that we are kind of growing up in the atmosphere of. And so because of that, this sort of an exercise where we take a closer look at them can be very, very fruitful for anybody, really. But as we go through Judaism, I want to understand some basic things. I want to understand what it is that really characterizes this religion in terms of its beliefs, what it is that helps us see the influence of this particular religion. How do we see the influence of this religion? Well, not just other religions at the time or in the future, but also in our entire civilization since its inception, okay? So moving into this, there's one more thing I want to focus on, or to kind of preempt my students with, which is that when we're looking at these world religions, as you might have sensed from the last video, we are not going to be emphasizing the actions and the, shall we say, the typical kind of sociological or historical behavior of the Jewish people, for example. We're not going to be looking at, oh, how is Judaism and, Israel and the different groups of Jewish, different religious groups of Jews behaving to this day. We're not interested in that. We're not going to be interested in, what's happened to the Jews throughout history. And the same thing holds true for the Christians, and the same thing will hold true for the Muslims. We are more interested in this particular unit in what it is that these particular faiths are teaching, what it is that they put forward in their texts, and what it is that they believe. That's the first and primary thing I really want to understand. And I say this for two different reasons. Number one, because I personally think that is more important moving forward in a course like this, that we really need to fully, or at least to the best of our abilities, make a decisive effort in trying to understand what it is that we are encountering here, what it is that the claims of this belief system are. And the second reason is because I'd like to try to avoid what my students kind of call "yeah, but"ism, which is what we usually see when we have a religion that we encounter in history, and we have groups or members of that particular religion, either big or small groups, behaving in a way that's quite embarrassing or quite contrary to what the religious group or what the religion is actually setting forth as proper behavior. In other words, people acting inconsistently with the religion. Now, if that's a subject that you're interested in, and how do we address that? How do we, address the possible dangers and the possible issues within religion and that arise from religion? We're going to talk about that. That's going to be in the seminar. I absolutely want my students to explore that and to express that and wrestle with that. That is an absolutely essential, critical question I think we should ask about religions in general. It's just not appropriate at this particular level. So when we are approaching Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and in these videos right here, what I want you to do is kind of lay all that to the side, lay all of your thoughts about Jews, Christians, and Muslims to the side, lay all of the negative examples of history to the side, and I want you to just sit down and try to absorb and try to really comprehend in the most objective and kind of open way that you can what it is that these religions are claiming and what it is that they are putting forward, and also the way that they're putting them forward. How does that impact us? How do we think about this, and how do we see the influences of these beliefs moving forward. Okay. So with that, I like to open up every one of these religion presentations with a little phrase from each religion. So the one I gave here is this phrase below called, which goes, Bereshit bara Elohim and Adonai would be the next word. Bereshit bara Elohim, which is simply the Hebrew, the first line of the Torah, the Old Testament in Hebrew. In the beginning, God created, and in the rest of the phrase is God created the heaven and the earth. Okay, that is, in some sense, iconic to Judaism for its emphasis on, as the first line of the Bible, as the first kind of maxim of the Jewish religion, that God is central, that this monotheistic being that created the world and is now governing the world and trying to guide his people, that is central. That is the central pillar of Judaism as we understand it. Okay. So moving forward, some other basic beliefs of Judaism. Number one, God has revealed himself to the Hebrew people starting with Abraham. Okay, so Abraham, formerly called Abram, and then Abraham, after God meets him and renames him, is seen as the father of the as the name goes, the Abrahamic faiths, which we see in the book of Genesis. Abraham is that early in the Bible. God has made a covenant with the Jewish people. So a covenant, a kind of agreement and relationship to be close in particular to this group of people. Now we see that in some sense playing itself out at a very historical level as well, that the Jewish tribes and the Jewish people and their ancestors grew up in a area of the world, in the kind of the Middle Eastern area of the world where they originated, surrounded by a majority of polytheistic religions. So this idea of a doggedly monotheistic group at the time was very unique, was very unheard of at that particular time, and was what I think singled out Judaism to be the frankly kind of weird and sort of alien group in the area. But what we see, of course, through history is that this relatively strange and relatively different group ends up becoming like the springboard for some of the most fundamental and basic beliefs that we see affecting us even now in the Western world. Now, the third one here is that God's teachings come through the prophets and are passed down in the Torah or the Old Testament, if you want to refer to it like a Christian. So the Torah, meaning the books of the Bible, including the book of Genesis, Exodus, the book of Kings, and the prophets Isaiah and Daniel and all these kind of things, and the Psalms of King David, the book of Kings, all this sort of stuff. All of these, accumulated, and a couple more that I missed, of course, accumulate into the Jewish sacred texts. And it is through these texts, which, as you will see, are mostly narrative, are mostly stories, that God's teachings come through to the world, okay, and are understood through the Jewish people. Now, one thing that I always ask, and we're going to skip through this real quick. I don't usually ask essential questions anymore, but I like to ask how it is that these particular beliefs are unique in the ancient world, and we kind of already covered that with the whole presence of monotheism this early in history. So the history of Judaism, about 1713 BC, that should be a circa. We have Abraham's covenant made. It's usually the date that we ascribe Abraham, setting down the covenant of the Lord, the covenant of God. And about 1407 BC, so that's about 2,400 years ago, we have the exodus of the Jews from Egypt after their persecution under Pharaoh Ramesses, or as he would later be renamed, Ozymandias, or also named Ozymandias. And then in the year 970 BC, we have the first temple, of the first sacred holy temple constructed in Jerusalem, and it was later, of course, destroyed and then rebuilt, and then destroyed again for its final time by the Romans in 70 AD. Okay, very, very infamous date for the Jewish people. Now, some major figures. I'm not going to go through these that quickly. We're not going to go in much depth with them. Abraham, of course, was the first man that God makes a covenant with. He really is the father of Israel, the father of nations. Moses is how would you call it? The central and the exemplar in the Jewish faith of a man who tries to be close to God's heart and be close to God's true intent for his people. And he's also, of course, the prophet who led the Hebrews out of Egypt, out of their persecution. Then we have King David, the iconic, if you're looking for a king, like the iconic king for the Jews, it was King David, an incredibly complex and interesting character, very rich in his own right, very flawed, as everybody in the Old Testament is, very, very flawed, but struggles with his flaws in a way that apparently pleases God, the Lord, in the story. And we threw Solomon in there just kind of as a side figure. Solomon is the son of King David, the king of Israel. Known for his profound wisdom and wealth. Yeah, we're not going to talk about Solomon all that much, but it's just a good figure for us to know moving forward. Some general forms that you'll see Judaism taking. Orthodox Judaism, it is the most isolated group, okay, smallest group. Conservative Judaism, slightly common, a little bit more common nowadays, usually a little bit abstract in its theology, usually a little bit difficult to comprehend. And of course, Reformed Judaism, which is the most common group that we see today. Now, less interesting, or we are less interested in all of those nitty-gritty details. What we are more interested in is taking a look at these texts, these primary texts about Judaism. So the first text, of course, that we're going to look at is the book of Genesis, the first book, the first page of Genesis, actually, which as soon as it loads, we will see right here. Okay. So I have my students read the first, as you see, 23 lines of Genesis. Now, most of us who either know Sunday school or have a general understanding of religion know what this story is about. It is the creation story. Now, interesting question right off the bat. What's the genre of this particular text? Is Genesis supposed to be read as history, as a scientific, factual, completely factual text? Well, or is it supposed to be read as something that's theological and scientific and historical? Or is it something that's supposed to be read as more theological and mythic in its design? Well, interesting question overall. But I think one thing that I really like to emphasize to my students of history is that that question was at the very best undecided for Jews and for people of the ancient world up until about 200 or 300 years ago. The choice on how to read Genesis was an open question. However, the precedent for reading Genesis as a sort of creation myth, as some sort of less than literal text, was always there. That precedent was there very clearly. The Jews, up until like even like medieval Jewish philosophers like Maimonides, had very clearly an understanding that this was meant to be read figuratively and metaphorically and convey theological truths in a poetic way. We had very, there are obviously elements that demonstrate that some people were trying to read this as a little bit more literal or have at least some historical validity to it. That's fair. That's absolutely around. But ladies and gentlemen, this notion, which is a little bit controversial nowadays, has been, this notion that Genesis must be read literally, or that any of the books of the Old Testament or the New Testament must be read 100% literally, is in fact a byproduct of a controversy that happened about, again, at best 300 years ago, with the reemergence or with the emergence of the Great Awakening in American culture, which gave birth to what is more commonly known as the fundamentalist movement, fundamentalist Christianity, which does actively seek to read Genesis as literal, as a clearly literal and historical text. Now, as to which I advocate for my students to read, that's up to you. That's up to you to do that, essentially, to pick which one you want, which one you think is more valid. There are very clear arguments that say, look, Genesis is meant to be read like a creation myth. It is not meant to be read literally. And then the fundamentalists will obviously have arguments to say, no, it very clearly does have. There are reasons why we should read this literally. And there are all the arguments in between for kind of having another nuanced view. As to which one you think is more valid, that's up to you. For our purposes here, I'm going to adopt a little bit more on the side, I'm going to adopt an interpretation that's a little bit more on the side of the metaphorical and the mythical, just to demonstrate how some Jews would read this particular text and what truths they would discern from it. So again, take that with a grain of salt if you don't agree with me, but if you do, whatever, that's fine. So Line number one. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Okay? God creates everything. And the earth was without form. Hello, just messed up this. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Okay. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. Okay. So in the beginning here, yes, God is creating things. God is moving above the face of the waters, usually translated tohu vabohu, the formless chaos, the void. So, a couple things here. If we move down to our questions, what is God doing in this chapter? Creating is the most basic one. Dividing seems to be one as well, or at least organizing things. He's separating light from darkness. He's separating the form from the formless, the formed from the formless, from order into chaos. Some of my attentive students will realize and maybe make a connection back to our mythology unit where we saw in the creation story the Greek gods doing the exact same thing in forming the world and kind of dividing the world into its sections and its categories. So we see this here with light and dark. We see also that God says that the light is good, divides it from the darkness. Keep an eye on this phrase, and it was good. Line 5, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." Okay? And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear," and it was so. Okay, so again, we are separating the waters from the lands, and we're separating night from day, we're separating the sky from the earth, all this kind of stuff. Okay, so further organization. And the earth brought forth, I'm sorry, it's now line 11. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yield seed, the fruit yield fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth," and it was so. Okay? So now we're not just structuring and organizing the world, we're actually directing the earth to give forth life as well. So bringing forth further creation. And the earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. Okay. So this action of bringing forth life is a good. This action of existence, the existence of life, the existence of matter is good. Important point. But moving on, number 13. And the evening and the morning were the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. Okay, so further creation, further organization into the structured, more complex world that we have today. And then this declaration that it was good. It is a good thing. Okay. 19, we're almost done. And the evening and the morning were the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creatures that hath life, and the fowl that may fly above the earth in the firmament, in the open firmament of heaven." And God created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. Okay, so now the multiplying and the dividing of creatures, first from the water, then in the air, and so on and so forth. And this is declared good as well. 23. And the evening and the morning were the fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth the living creatures after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and the beasts of the earth after his kind. And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. Okay, we're kind of getting almost a poetic repetition here. And God said, let us make man in our image. Okay, whoa. New couple lines here, important lines. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female, created he them. And God blessed them. And God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. That's the creation narrative of Genesis. Of course, what comes next is the Garden of Eden. We're not going to get into that, but we're going to focus on this creation narrative to give us some of the fundamental principles of Judaism. So we said God is creating here. That's fine. He's doing a little bit more, though. He is creating and dividing and organizing. And he seems to be directing or influencing the creation of further life, kind of creating, if you want, sub-creators in other animals, and then, of course, in Adam and Eve, in humans, human beings. Now, that's the last thing that he does, is that he creates a creature that apparently is the finale of his whole orchestra, or his whole sequence of creation. He creates these final beings that are made in his likeness, in his image, whatever the heck that means. Now, then he, of course, directs them to do two things: to continue the process of creation, continue the process of growth and plenishing the earth, but also to have some sort of dominion and subdual over the earth. Again, whatever that means, we'll see. Now, kind of sub questions here. B, or should be A and B, is asking, how do God's actions characterize him in lines 1 to 13? Well, again, as a being that is going to give forth more creation, as a being that is interested in organization, interested in life, that's the one kind of major thing we need to understand here, is that God is primarily, first and foremost, interested in expanding existence and expanding life. So God is, as Judaism will say, the God of life, the God of creation, the God that lives forever, this sort of thing, the God that gives forth life. So all of those things that are in the nature of being and in the nature of reality are infused into God's nature. And he sees those things as good as well. That's what that continual declaration means. It was good, it was good, it was good. He affirms all of that as a good thing. Okay. Now, for the third little sub-question here, how is this story different and similar to other creation stories we know of? A couple different things. Some of my students immediately, of course, see the similarities, right? We have a being that is divine, that is above all things, kind of pushing forward the whole sequence of creation and, increasing the complexity, leading, of course, to the creation of human beings. Now, aside from that overt, kind of obvious similarity, the difference between order and chaos, the creator being present, the easy differences that we see here are, number one, that it is one being, that there's just one singular being that is doing the whole act of creation here. That's different than what we see in the pagan world. All right, we don't see Gaia, we don't see Uranus, we don't see the great giant that is divided among things. We don't see the two beings that we're going to see in Norse mythology, giving forth the life to other creations. We see just one being. All right, it's a simplicity here. The other, I think, really interesting point here is that the creation narrative is moving in a sequence from simplicity to further complexity. So, of course, this is where some religious people and some, scientifically inclined people will point up and say, well, look at this. This looks, ironically, this kind of looks a lot like evolution. This looks a lot like a poetic and a theological version of the same story of evolution. We're moving from a kind of very simplistic form of being, a form of creation, a form of sequence in life, to a much more complex one that eventually climaxes with the evolution, the creation of human beings. That's one way that this is distinctly different from other creation stories. So that's rather noteworthy. Now, number two, what does it mean that God sees that things are good, such as in line 10, 12, and 18? What does this reveal that the Jewish religion values? Well, two things. I think we already mentioned this, but I want to reiterate them. Two things that we see being called good here. Number one is either the division of things, the properly ordering of things, or the existence of things is good. So the existence of light is good. The existence of the earth is good. The existence of the plants are good. The existence of the waters is good. Existence, being, is good. Okay. So the Jewish religion fundamentally says the created world is good. The physical world is good. Plants are good. Food is good. Animals are good. Our bodies are good, clothes are good, et cetera, et cetera. I know the whole thing about clothes with Genesis, but whatever. The things are good. Everything in the world is good. This demonstrates, ladies and gentlemen, that the Jewish religion is not, to refer to our last lesson, a fundamentally idealist or a pantheistic religion. It says that all things are good in the created world. So even though God, as you can see in this story, is separate from the world, right? There is the creator who is then creating everything kind of separate from himself, not totally alien from himself, but separate. Those things are good. Those things are seen as good because God values them. God is creating them, and it exists. And so God is fundamentally defined as something that is interested and that values existence. Okay, sure. Now, a practical example of that I love to, two practical examples are number one, the Satan example, right? I had a professor in college who used to kind of tease us in a religion class by saying there is nothing. I'm sorry. What did he say? Oh, he said he phrased it this way: everything about the devil is good. Now, I knew what he meant literally by that. He didn't mean, okay, the devil's good, let's all go be Satanists. No, what he means is that the devil's existence as such, as a being, is good. His strength is good. His mind is good. Like the fact that it exists is good. What's bad is obviously what that being does with all those things, right? His, will to do all these evil things, that's all terrible. His twisted, sinful nature, that's all terrible, that's all evil. But the fact that we have this like maximally, like amazingly, gloriously powerful being in that angel or whatever angel you want to talk about, or whatever person or animal you want to talk about, that's all good. So God likes this. He's like, yes, I like having these big, amazing, grand things, be it dinosaurs, whales, humans, cats, caterpillars, whatever. He likes it all. The other example here that I like to give to emphasize this value is that this demonstrates that Judaism is not what's called a Gnostic religion. The Gnostics were a group of religious believers that kind of, they formed and kind of broke off a little bit from Christianity in the early first century. And they were characterized by this belief that the material world, the earthly world, was evil. It was hopelessly corrupted. It was bad, and we want to divide ourselves from the world. We want to get to a point of being where we are purely matter or matterless, and we are purely spirit and purely mind. That's not consistent with Judaism, Judaistic beliefs. So, and the same thing for Christianity, by the way, as you're going to see. So this idea that, as a religion, as being religious in Judaism, you need to be entirely focused on the next life and the spiritual and all this kind of stuff. And that's the only thing that's important. And all of the things in the world are evil, our temptations are wicked and corrupted. No, that is totally anti-Jewish. That Judaism is firmly going to affirm all the material things in this world are good. We, of course, corrupt them, and we have problems with them, and we don't have a proper relationship with them, et cetera, et cetera. But in their nature, in their existence, they're good. Okay. So the second thing that Judaism is pointing out as a value here is the act of creation, is the act of expanding life, right? Of bringing forth more life. So obviously in the animal kingdom and in the plant kingdom, that looks like the reproduction act, right? The reproductive act of creating more plants, creating more animals. Sure. But we're also going to see the same thing, as you saw in the last couple lines, in the creation of Adam and Eve, or in the creation of human beings. Now, I like to be a little bit controversial, or I like to be a little bit edgy with my students, with my classes, because I like to point out that God's first commandment, his first actual commandment chronologically to anyone in the Bible, is to quote unquote be fruitful and multiply. Okay, what does this mean? Everyone knows what that means. Everyone knows what that means to go to what the process is to go make babies. That's the first thing that God tells you to do. So in terms of what does Judaism value, Judaism values sex, properly within its, normal context, within a healthy context. It likes this. It likes this act of having a bunch of kids, and that's all good. So again, kind of running contrary to what we might have approached religion with in the first place. A lot of people think, oh, religion is very anti-sex. Religion's very kind of, afraid of sex. We don't like it. It's taboo. Not so, at least in Judaism. They're saying, no, it's great. They're not saying go, be promiscuous every night and day with someone different. Don't have like a revolving door. But they're saying, no, get married, have, it's Adam and Eve here. So it's like, yeah, have someone that you're going to dedicate yourself to and love that person entirely, and then bring forth children. That's all very valid. That's very good. Okay. Now, for number 3, consider the last 2 lines. How do these lines characterize humans in the Jewish religion? Well, the point that we always linger on here is this image of God phrase. What does this mean? That human beings are made in the image of God. Does it mean literally that we look like God? Like if we were to, have a vision of God, he would look like a human being? Probably not, right? Maybe that's part of it, but probably not entirely. I think what it means in some sense, again, in a more poetic sense, is that the faculties that make God distinct, some of those faculties are given to human beings. And I think the most clear and obvious one is the presence of a conscious mind and a conscious independent will. So animals do not have a self-conscious mind. They do not know that they exist, right? Maybe talk about the apes and the dolphins, or dogs to a very, very minimal degree, not to the degree that human beings do. We are the pinnacle of neurological development in the world, right? We absolutely are. We are, in that sense, the crown of creation that we have seen so far in the world. So that kind of makes sense that we are the closest to divinity. We are like God in that sense. We are additionally made in the image of God in the sense that we have free will. I know it's got like strings on us. We have things that kind of inhibit our free will, that make it hard for us to really follow our free will, blah, blah, blah. But we fundamentally have this ability to choose one way or the other, just like God. God is free, just as we are. Now, one consequence of this belief in the inherent kind of image of God, the imago Dei in Latin, within human beings, is to create, ladies and gentlemen, is to give rise to this belief that human beings are inherently valuable, right? Now, look at the implications to this. We go back in the Jewish text and we look at the very first freaking page. It says, he created male and female, created he them in his image. So that didn't say Adam is created in God's image, right? That didn't say, okay, just the men. That didn't say, okay, just these men in this particular nation. It didn't just say these men in this particular social group are in his image. No, it says humans are made in the image of God. Most of my attentive students can see the logic of where that is going to lead. That is going to produce and going to eventually, through the domino effects of beliefs down the ages, going to produce a statement like all men and women are created equal, right? That is going to give rise to this idea of universal human value. We will see it again in Christianity. It absolutely is present in the Old and New Testament. Yeah. I know that there are examples of like, oh, women are like this, men are like this. It goes back and forth. We have that, that gender tension. But I mean, like, if you're looking for a case to say the opposite, to say that they're equal, I think Judaism absolutely teaches that from page 1. I think that's very, very clear. Okay. So the last point that people usually cling on to, so we got the value of human beings, we got the image of God. And then the last thing people like to focus on, particularly nowadays when environmentalism is an interesting topic that people like to attend to, is this notion of human beings kind of as the stewards of creation, right? As the people who are meant to subdue and kind of help tame the world. So apparently, God is not entirely content with nature just kind of flourishing in, let's use our old symbolic terms, in continuous chaos. That's not what he's 100% on board with. He wants to put human beings in the world that are in his image and have them sort of tame and subdue it, not destroy it, not suppress it, a la what we saw with Uranus and Kronos. That's not what he's saying. He's like, no, subdue it, right? The image, of course, that we get is the garden, right? Have a place of order where we can have life flourish more in abundance, right? So the example that I give to my students there is that God is kind of, in this sense, aiming for us to be more like someone who's tending a fireplace, right? He doesn't just want fire to kind of go nuts and, in its life and creation, just kind of overrun all of creation. That's not what he's looking for. He's like, no, you also don't want to constrain it to the point where there is no life, there is no fire, right? You kind of wall in the fire too much. He wants human beings to kind of find that beautiful balance between order and between chaos so that we can have a more flourishing sort of life. You see the same thing, like I was just discussing with the sexual symbolism, right? You don't want in complete abstinence. You don't want someone who's never going to reproduce. That's not really what we're going for here. And you also don't want someone who is like Genghis Khan, like reproducing with everything that moves. That's not good. So too much on the extremes. He wants to find that balance, which will provide more goodness and more creation overall. So that's Genesis, okay? And as you can see, a lot packed into there. All right, we could kind of keep digging into this more and more and more, but those are just some of the most basic things that we can see in the book of Genesis. Now, the next one that we're going to look at, and a little bit more brevity, is the encounter between Moses and the burning bush. So most of us are familiar with the story of Moses. He grows up as a Hebrew in the land of Egypt. During the time that the Hebrews are enslaved, essentially, but he was adopted into the Egyptian royalty, and through a bunch of different means, he is exiled. He chooses to leave Egypt, usually on a crime of killing somebody, and he goes out into the desert for I think 40 years, something like that. And as a result, he lives a shepherd's life and all this kind of stuff. But then he encounters God. He actually has an encounter with God. And God gives him, as always happens, whenever God appears in the Bible, he gives him a directive. He tells him he needs to go do something. So let's take a look at that. I want to look at how God interacts with Moses and how God appears and what the Jewish religion is kind of showing us or demonstrating to us about its beliefs through this particular passage. Okay, so we have here, how many lines from Exodus? Only 15. Not too bad. And by the way, some of my critics or some teachers or parents would be surprised. They're like, are you actually expecting ninth graders to be able to read and comprehend these texts? Well, in part, not entirely. That's why we're here. But I do like to throw this at them. And this is, as you can see, the King James translation. To your surprise, to the students' surprise, and to my pleasant surprise, I see that students are able to comprehend quite a bit. They might not comprehend at every level at all, but that's why I'm there to kind of help them go a little bit deeper into this. So again, to the point that I mentioned before, don't be afraid to really throw some of these things in front of students. You'd be very surprised how much they can absorb and kind of consume. And sometimes they're actually very eager to consume because it is something that's very famous and very well known, like the Bible. And they're like, oh, look, here's the original. He's not dumbing it down. He's not giving us an article about the Bible. He's giving us the Bible. Let's actually look. So let's see what it says. Number 1. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led a flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto Moses in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. Okay, that, of course, is the famous burning bush out of which God's voice comes. This is the form that God's presence takes in the Bible for the Old Testament. This is one of the most famous appearances of God. If you have not seen the film The Prince of Egypt, the animated film The Prince of Egypt, please go watch it. It's one of the best animated films of all time. The cliche joke about it is it's one thing that the Christians and Jews and all the atheists all agree on is that the Prince of Egypt is a fantastic film. So go look at that for sure. Now, he comes into this burning bush, and we have Moses say this: I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Draw not nigh hither, put off thy shoes from thy feet, for the place whereupon thou stands is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmakers, for I know their sorrows, and I am come down to deliver them out of the land of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land unto a good land, and a large, and unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come unto me, and I have also seen the oppression whereupon the Egyptians oppress them. Come now, therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And Moses said unto God, Who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, Certainly I will be with thee, and this shall be a token unto thee that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain. And Moses said unto God, Behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, and say that unto them, The God of your fathers hath sent me unto you, they shall say to me, What is his name? What shall I say unto them? And God said to Moses, I am that I am. And he said, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. And God said, Moreover unto Moses, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, The Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, hath sent me unto you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial unto all generations. Okay. Moving scene in many ways, especially if you go see that clip in The Prince of Egypt. So number one, the imagery here, the burning bush, okay? So a bush, ablaze, yet not consumed, okay? So if you watch our video in the Universal Materials series on symbolism and imagery, this should throw up a bajillion red flags for you. This is classic universal imagery being used here. Obviously within a religious context, carrying religious understanding, so we need to kind of interpret it in that sense, but definitely make note of that. Fire and a bush and a tree, essentially, like a growing thing. Okay, now a little bit deeper here for the section B, how does this imagery characterize God? Why does God choose this form to speak out of? Consider the symbolic meaning of each part. So first and foremost, the bush. Okay, why a bush? Well, he's in the desert, right? So it's not going to be a place of an overabundance of life. So apparently this form of life is associated with God, right? This idea of life, once again, like we saw in Genesis, the source of life or something that gives forth life. That is, again, a focus symbol for what describes God's nature. And of course, the most important feature here, I think, is the fire, right? Why is it that that fire is associated with God? Well, again, go back to the symbolism section we did, and you'll see that all of the otherworldly implications of fire are made manifest in it if you just look a little bit closer. So what does this say about God? God is a kind of otherworldly, radiant, divine, life-giving presence, bringing light, warmth, illumination, knowledge to the world. And yet, interestingly enough, all of the negative elements of fire are removed here. There's no burning, there's no consuming, right? There's none of that dark side of the fire element is here at all. So that's really otherworldly, right? So God is essentially characterized as all of the positive aspects of fire. So warmth, right? Giving you comfort, giving you protection, giving you life, giving you understanding, all this sort of stuff. And the combination, the one interpretation that I was always interested in with this particular image of God is this idea that as God is coming closer to the world, as God is kind of coming into the world more and more and more, the closer he gets to our world, the more full of life the world becomes. So I'm sure my fantasy nerds can think of images like this, where we have a being or a magical substance of, essentially divine or virtuous properties coming into a setting, and then as a result that setting becomes more filled with life. The plants and the animals start kind of growing as a result of that being's presence. I think that's what we're seeing here, except to the nth degree with the fire, right? So it's like you imagine God enters into a room and that room becomes ablaze, right? Now, is it literally going to look like it's on fire? Maybe in part. Maybe it just means luminous. Maybe it means like, cosmic and amazing. And like everything is heightened. Everything is brought to a higher level of existence, a higher level of life. So the closer God gets to the world, the more full of life the world becomes. I think that's totally consistent with what Judaism would understand God to be, which is the source of life itself at every dimension. So very, very powerful ancient symbol right there. And number two, what's God's missions to Moses? How does this characterize God's relationship with the Jewish people? Well, a couple things. Number one, it describes God as active and interested in human affairs, right? God is not, as deism would claim, this kind of like abstract, absentee landlord, absentee father. No, God is very, very interested in being involved in human affairs. Okay, sure. However, there's another element here, which is that God didn't just appear to Moses, as some religious students or religious studies students will point out. He didn't just appear to Moses to make his existence manifest, right? It's not like Moses is sitting there kind of, really pondering the philosophical question, does God exist? Here's some arguments for, here's some arguments against, is atheism true? And then bam, the burning bush appears and God's like, yo, what's up, peace, I'm real, goodbye. That's not really what's going on here. It's almost like that question is laid aside, and God's like going to appear for what purpose? To give him more faith, to give him more understanding, possibly. I think, but the clear reason why God appears here and every section of the Old Testament is to give a mission, is to make you go do something. So this, linking back to what we just said, demonstrates, guys and gals, that God seems to be more interested in our actions, in our way of conducting life in Judaism. He's not as interested in your own personal and philosophical beliefs concerning his existence. He's like, no, this is what you need to do, though. You need to, live this way. You need to help these people, all this kind of stuff. Okay. Now, it also demonstrates that God is not okay with the plight of the Jewish people, which is essentially a pretty nasty form of slavery, right? Now, there's another subsection we could talk about there about, what does slavery look like in the Old Testament when it's the Jews who are enslaving people? What's the difference between their slaves, which is essentially indentured servitude, and the difference between Egyptian slavery, which is like a little bit more intense, shall we say? I'll leave it there. I'll leave it at the point that particular form of slavery was distinctly intense and apparently not liked by God in this section. Okay, so God is not a fan of that sort of treatment of other people. Again, linking back to what we know about him from Genesis. Okay, that he does not like human beings treating other human beings poorly, right? Now, number three, consider line 11 to 12. What is Moses saying here, and how does this characterize him, that is Moses? What is God's response? How does that characterize him, that is God? Moses replies, if you're familiar with the hero's journey, he replies with, "I can't do this. Who am I to go and go, talk to Pharaoh, who is essentially his stepbrother? What am I to do? What am I supposed to do here? How could I do this?" Now, the Prince of Egypt demonstrates this rather beautifully, and my students can usually pick it up without having seen the movie. But it's most likely that Moses is, number one, afraid to leave his area of comfort and confront this severe challenge in front of him. But I think it's also that Moses could be a little bit guilty, right? Suffering from a little bit of shame. He does not think he is worthy to do God's will. However, God looks past this. God says, "It's okay. I will be with you." Again, how does this characterize God? This shows, number one, a little bit of humility, apprehension, and a little bit of weakness and fear on Moses' side. On God's side, this shows a little bit of encouragement. So God is acting like a little bit more of a mentor. It shows his acceptance and his, you could say, tolerance, if you want, of Moses's shortcomings, but of his, divine providence, in the sense that he knows that Moses can do a lot of good if he is pushed, if he is guided. And it also shows that more kind of nurturing side of God, because he says, "I will be with you. I'll be with you the whole way," right? So I'm not going to make you do this alone. I'll be with you. So that communion, again, that kind of covenants relationship that we saw, and that presence, that omnipresence that we know about in figures of religion like God in this particular religion. Okay, so that's all there. And finally, wonderful mystery about this particular passage. What is God's name in this passage? Why do you think that this is his name, and what does it mean? Okay, I am that I am. What? What does that mean? Well, it's a fun topic to cover, because there's a couple different interpretations here. The most basic one, ladies and gents, comes from the Jewish text, the Jewish language itself. The translation of the term "I am that I am," Yahweh, is a difficult thing to understand, because the translation that we get is not entirely accurate, not entirely proper. The Jewish scholars that I've talked to usually say the more appropriate way you would translate that is "I am ing," ing. So God is saying, "I am ing," I am action, I am the one who does things, right? So that's one way to interpret that. Well, let's look at that. So God is the God of action. He is the God of activity. He is the active force. That's who he is. So that, in some sense, makes complete sense with how we understand God in the Old Testament and in this particular religion. God is not a deistic God. He is not an abstract force. He is a personality who will act in the world, who will do things. He's not going to sit idly by. He is involved in history. Okay. So this also opens up a characteristic of biblical religion that is a little bit distinct from other forms of religion, where some religions describe the relationship between human beings and the divine as kind of like us trying to reach up to the divine, right? Like we try to practice the right, rituals. We try to, perfect ourselves in some way, shape, or form to get to the divine. Whereas in Judaism and in Christianity, in biblical religion, we see the opposite sort of thing happen. We see God being the one who initiates that, God being the one who comes reaching down to humanity, and then us having to respond in kind. So that's one way to interpret that, the "I am ing" way. The other one, I've seen Jewish scholars interpret this as just "I am that I am," like I am myself. I am true to myself, right? I am going to be who you think, who you truly know that I am. That's one way to do it. Thomas Aquinas, I think it was, interpreted it. I think it was Thomas Aquinas, interpreted it this way. And I personally kind of like this interpretation, even though if it's not entirely originally valid to the original text, but it's still interesting to understand. I am that I am. I am. If we look at that phrase, I am. Okay. So I means what? It's personhood. That is a distinct person, a being with a will, right? This is not, again, like an abstract force. God is not a rock. God is not the wind. God is a being who has a will, who will do things according to what he wants to do. He is self-conscious. And then I am. What is the am there? Existence, right? The verb of is, the verb of being, right? I am existence. So Aquinas, I think it was, interpreted that as God saying, I am existence itself. I am the source of existence. I am existence with personality to it as well. That's what he is, essentially. So in some sense, he is the source of all being. Again, consistent with Genesis, a little bit more abstract and philosophical, but I think still valid. Okay, so that is Exodus. That's a little section from Exodus. Again, way more we could say about Judaism if we looked at both the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus. There's a lot more, but these are just, again, little blips that I want to give you some ideas about the religion here. And last but not least, we're going to talk about the book of Isaiah. Okay, so a prophet. Now, the prophet Isaiah, we don't need to know the context, but this is after Israel leaves Egypt and establishes itself a little bit. And we eventually develop this sort of pattern in the Jewish religion. We see it in Genesis, and we see it continued into Exodus, a lot in Exodus, and then again it continues through the rest of the Bible, the rest of the Old Testament. And the pattern is essentially this: Israel, that is the Hebrews, are rescued by God or given some kind of gift from God, and they exalt in it, and they are righteous, and they are thankful, and they are amazing. And this produces prosperity for them. However, as a result of that prosperity, or maybe after that prosperity, they fall away from God. They behave more sinfully. They behave just in a generally negative, less virtuous way, and thus lose their communion with God in some sense. Then we need to have either a prophet come and help Israel turn back onto the proper road of righteousness, or something really terrible will happen to Israel, which will force them to kind of come back into relationship with God. And then the cycle kind of repeats again, right? So Israel is kind of constantly going through these undulations of like its relationship with God, okay? And by the way, that is kind of what we need to understand in terms of what the word Israel means. Israel means to struggle with God, to wrestle with God, right? There's a story, of course, in the Bible where that name comes from and why that is. But it's an important thing to realize that in the Jewish religion, the process of us as human beings, of us as a group of people, of us as a nation, of us as an entire being of or group of beings, of human beings, are meant in some way to wrestle with God, and God approves of this wrestling. He thinks that that's good. Instead of ignoring him, instead of completely falling out of communion with him, instead of lying to him, he wants that honest response. And so if you look deeper into the Jewish religion, you'll see in the Psalms that King David is just like screaming at God at times. We see this happen in the story of the figure Israel, who is constantly resisting God and doesn't want to deal with what God is pushing him to do. We see it a little bit with Moses. We're going to see it in our seminar when we discuss the book of Job, is that this raging at God with your problems and this kind of just outpouring of honest catharsis is something that God approves of. And so in the Jewish religion, we like to see that, right? They like to see that, especially. They're like, give us the honest reaction, give us all of the emotion, pour it all out so we can deal with it. Okay. That being said, the role of the prophets in that whole tension and that drama is one that we need to understand here. A prophet, ladies and gentlemen, is not merely someone who can talk to God directly and who can tell the future, right? That is a very simplistic understanding of what a prophet is. The more basic, principled way of understanding what a prophet is someone who can see hidden truths that not many other people of their time can see, and calls them out, and calls out those truths and says, look, here is what we are missing. Now, that can look like you're telling the truth, or you're telling the future, rather. Like, if I see a problem that we're all doing, if we don't correct it, this is what's going to happen. Everyone's like ignores them, and then something does happen. It's like, oh my gosh, they can tell the future. They're a prophet. It's like, yeah, it's like, no, they just saw what was happening, right? It wasn't that they were necessarily, getting visions of the future. It was just that they knew what was happening, and they're like, oh my gosh, if this continues, this is what will happen. Okay, that's kind of what a prophet is: someone who sees hidden truths. Well, Isaiah is the same way. Isaiah here is a prophet, and he's going to give forth kind of the verbiage, and he's going to kind of speak forth what God has told him. So let's take a look at what he says. Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord hath spoken. And here is what the Lord says through Isaiah. I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me. Okay, so immediately there's that tension, right? I have helped the nation of Israel, I have helped the Jews, and they have rebelled against me. They have not listened to me. The ox knoweth his owner, and the ass his master's crib. But Israel doth not know, my people doth not consider. Does not know, my people doth not consider. In other words, Israel doesn't seem to know its place in the world, doesn't seem to know who its master is or who really is the one caring for it, where its rightful place is. A sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, a seed of evildoers, children that are corrupters. They have forsaken the Lord. They have provoked the Holy One of Israel unto anger. They are gone away backwards. So pretty clear there, right? Israel, in whatever way that it's living right now, the Jews, in whatever way that they have been behaving right now, is not in line with how God wants them to live. Okay, which is, as we're going to see, a pretty basic way of moral living. Why should ye be stricken anymore? Ye will revolt more and more. The whole head is sick, and the whole heart faint. From the sole of the foot even unto the head, there is no soundness in it, but wounds and bruises, putrefying sores. They have not been closed, neither bound up, neither mollified with oil or with ointment. What does this mean? God / Isaiah here is basically using a metaphor of saying that the body of Israel, if Israel were like a body, it is putrefying. It's full of sores and bruises. It's not clean. It's just decaying. If we were to see the moral state of your soul's character personified in a human body, this is what it would look like. It would look awful. Okay. So he's saying, why should I, inflict any more upon you? Just look at you now. You look absolutely awful. You're just sick and dying. Your country is desolate. Your cities are burned with fire. Your land, strangers devour it in your presence, and it is desolate as overthrown by strangers. And Israel is left as a cottage in a vineyard, as a besieged city. Okay, so in other words, you guys are screwed. You're in a really, really bad state right now. You are not doing well, right? Israel is kind of like the homeless dude underneath the homeless drug addict kind of under the river, addicted to heroin right now. He's like, bro, you're a mess. Okay. Now, number 10. Hear the word of the Lord. To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices unto me, saith the Lord? I am full of the burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts, and I delight not in the blood of bullocks or of lambs or of he-goats. When ye come to appear before me, who hath required this at your hand to treat my courts? Bring no more vain offerings. Incense is an abomination unto me. The new moons and Sabbath, the calls for assemblies, I cannot away with. It is iniquity, even the solemn meeting. Your new moons and your appointed feasts, my soul hateth. They are trouble unto me. I am weary of them. When you spread your hands, I will hide mine eyes from you. Yea, when ye make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood. Okay. So what is God rejecting here? What is he saying? In short, some of my students usually reply with this. What he's rejecting here is essentially what we think of as typical religious practices: sacrifice, festivals, incense, rituals, all this sort of thing. God is saying, essentially, I hate it. I don't want any of it. I'm sick of this. Stop doing this. Your hands are full of blood. You are a mess as it is. Okay, well, that's weird, because I thought that's what religion was all about. I thought, if you're not doing well, if you're not in the right place, you're not being prosperous, whatever, you do the right rituals, you press the right religious buttons, you say the right words, and then God's kind of like a genie. He's like a slot machine, and then things are all better, right? Apparently not. So what is it that God wants? Isaiah tells us. wash you, make you clean, put away the evil of your doings before mine eyes. Cease to do evil, learn to do well, seek judgment, relieve the oppressed, judge the fatherless, plead for the widow. Come now, let us, before we get there, before we get to that last line, let's look at that. What is he telling people to do? In short, he's telling people to be good, to act morally, to be just and righteous and honest people. Stop doing evil. So, ironically, kind of what he's saying is he's addressing what a lot of my students and a lot of people might recognize, which is kind of religious inconsistency, right? You have an individual, let's say, who goes through all the religious practices. They go to church on Sundays, they do all the prayers, they got all this stuff going on, but they're just an awful, mean, cruel person. They're just arrogant. They mistreat their family, they mistreat their friends, their illicit business dealings, all this kind of stuff. And meanwhile, they just kind of go through the religious practices. Like, yeah, I messed up this week. I'm just going to go say a couple of Hail Marys and I'll be good, whatever. Like a mob member, they're going to blow somebody's head off and they're going to walk in and just do like a big sign of the cross and they'll be good. This is what God is kind of addressing. He's saying, no, I'm not interested in all the religious rituals right now. He's saying you need to put your own goodness, your own moral rightness first and foremost. So, a couple things here. Does this mean that Judaism is totally against religious practices? No, not at all. That's not what we're saying here. I think that's a wrong way to read this. What I think the clear and obvious way to read this is, guys, is to say that Judaism as a religion is more interested in, first and foremost, your moral actions, right? Your moral behavior. That is more important to God than your religious practice. Religious practices and all those sacrifices and stuff are still good and still necessary in this religion, but the moral actions come first in God's eyes, okay? So that one needs to come first, not this stuff under here. Now, the final statement here, very, very famous line in religion. God says, come now, let us reason together, saith the Lord. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool. In other words, he's using this very clear metaphor, this very clear imagery here, a simile, I should say, of an individual being stained with blood. In other words, being morally corrupt, being morally flawed, making many mistakes. And he is saying to that person, to those people, come back to me and I will clean you up and we can make things better. Okay, we can repent, we can amend what has been done wrong to some degree, and you can come back into communion with me. Okay, so for the questions here, how many are there? Let's see, it's only 4, not too bad. We'll do this and then this will conclude our discussion about Judaism. Number 1, how does line 2 immediately place the rest of this passage in context? Who are the children? What role does this place God in? The children are Israel, very clearly. They're the Jews. This places God in the form or in the role of a father, essentially. So that's kind of one way we could look at this. It's a father kind of pleading to his children to come back into proper relationship with him and live a proper life. Number 2, describe the imagery in lines 4 to 8. How does this characterize Israel? Well, we talked about how it really is a metaphor for their moral corruption, for the degradation and the debauchery that exists in their souls, essentially. The depravity of their souls and of their behavior, their immorality is what it is, essentially. For number 3, what is it that God hates in line 11 to 15? Why does God hate these things? Why do the following lines reveal about what God values? Like we said, God does not inherently, as it says here, hate religious practices and ceremonies. That's not a good way to read this. I think what happens, or what's meant to be understood here, is that God hates those things if they are placed before or placed in a place of a spot of higher importance than basic moral righteousness. Okay, so you need to be concerned first and foremost with being a just, fair, and good, and honest person, first and foremost, before you concern yourself with the proper rituals and sacrifices and Sabbaths and all this kind of stuff in the religion. That's clearly what I think is being said here. God values that stuff more than he does the rituals. Okay. And we see this in the Old Testament quite a bit. We're going to see it even more in the New Testament. I mean, the New Testament's going to just take this and run with it. But we see it a lot in the Old Testament as well. So, for example, we have figures in the Old Testament that are Gentiles, that are non-Jews, that God will praise over and against the Jewish people, which will irritate some religious individuals because they're like, wait a minute, how is that possible? You know, we believe the proper stuff and we're following the proper rituals. Why does God praise this person more than me, who's not even in my religion? Because that person is living in more consistency to what goodness is, to what God desires as goodness. Okay, so that's an interesting point of what Judaism very clearly establishes, that God fundamentally wants people to follow what people will call his law, what people will call righteousness, but what you and I could just call goodness. He wants people to be good. He wants people to be virtuous, as Socrates would say. Okay, that's something we see very clearly here. I lied. I missed one question, of course. Read the final line of this passage. How does this characterize God in light of the whole passage? Now, most of my students will look at that last line, and a lot of my students are Christians, so they'll see that and they'll be like, oh, this is clearly that characteristic of God being forgiving and God being loving and God kind of pleading with his children to come back to him, come back into communion with him. Now, yes, that actually is true. And of course, like I said, Christianity is going to take this, highlight it, and then they'll plaster it all over all the walls. They love this stuff. And it's wrong for us, by the way, I'm jumping ahead here a little bit. It's a total misreading to say that, you know, God in the Old Testament is completely different from the God in the New Testament. God in the New Testament's all, you know, Pillsbury Doughboy, nice and loving and fluffy duffy, and then the God in the Old Testament's all, you know, harsh and mean and all this kind of stuff. It's not accurate, right? As we're going to see, Jesus can be pretty harsh and also pretty loving, but so can the God of the Old Testament as well. So one last thing that this does to characterize God is, yes, it shows his forgiving nature. It shows his desire to be close to Israel. But one last point I'd like to push is why? Why does God want to bring Israel back into communion with him? What does this mean? This demonstrates the last advanced point that I like to make, that we've established from Genesis, that we can kind of see at the very last line here, which is that Judaism understands that God is the source of creation. God is the source of life. God is the source of being itself. And therefore, it's not too much of a leap to say that God, therefore, is the source of joy, of happiness, of true fulfilling happiness, often symbolized by physical health, physical life, all this kind of stuff. And so therefore, in some very deep but not too complex mystical sense, ladies and gents, the religion here is very clearly establishing this idea that the only way for us to truly be fulfilled and happy is when we are in right communion with God, whatever that means. If that means being virtuous and following his law, which is essentially goodness and virtue, okay, that's what that means, right? Now, we're going to see this in Christianity. We're going to see this in Islam. We're going to see this in a lot of literature as well, particularly when we start to read John Milton. So keep that in mind. Keep this very fundamental religious principle in mind, that the only way, the only source of full, true joy and happiness in our life is to be fulfilled in God. Now, we could look at that, if you want to find parallels to that, in a secular way, right? In a more kind of philosophical way. Socrates says the same thing. He says the only way for us to truly be fulfilled and happy in life is to be virtuous, is to be closer to the good, right? Again, just foreshadowing a little bit, or getting into a deeper point here, but the religious philosophers of the time of, whether it's the time of Judaism or Christianity during their height, will identify God with the transcendentals that Socrates put forward in our previous unit, where Socrates said it's the truth, the goodness, and the beauty that we need to kind of come into communion with and align ourselves to. Christians and Jews will basically say that is God. God is truth and goodness and beauty. God is those things. Those things are features of his being, which, again, that's a totally consistent claim. That makes total sense to us after just having read some of the most fundamental passages in this particular religion. So keep those points in mind. All right. And I know that was more of an advanced point here, going on a little bit of a tangent, but that's okay. It's going to help us in the future. Okay. So in short, that was Judaism for our particular, this section of our unit right now. We will return to Judaism one more time when we get to our final video here, when we discuss some seminar questions and some critical questions about religion, particularly the question of why does God allow evil? Judaism does a relatively strong job, or at least really does try to tackle this question quite a bit in the Old Testament. So we will see that at the end of this unit in a couple more videos. So stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, have a fantastic day. Bye.